One of the first things any new student of Marx learns is that Marxism distinguishes itself from the socialisms that came before by breaking with their alleged utopian tendencies. Marxism, by contrast, is said to be scientific. That is not, to be sure, by any means incorrect, but without sufficient contextualization and elaboration, it is, at best, vague and, at worst, dangerously misleading. And without contextualization and elaboration is precisely how these ideas have most often been presented. Ambiguity is the enemy of all clear-minded thought, of course, but all the more so for revolutionaries, people whose ideas, by definition, run against the grain of the culture in which they emerge. Being ambiguous under such circumstances does not simply invite misreading in the general sense, but allows the current of common sense to rush in and fill the gaps. Indeed, Marxist ideas run counter not only to the common sense of society at large, but even against that of socialist thinking in general. The essence of socialist common sense is utopianism, the very thing Marx's scientific socialism exists to be an alternative to. The distinction between utopian and scientific socialism is conveyed well by Engels when he wrote that, with the emergence of Marxist theory, quote, communism now no longer meant the concoction, by means of the imagination, of an ideal society as perfect as possible, but insight into the nature, the conditions, and the consequent general aims of the struggle waged by the proletariat. Engels could not have been more clear, and yet Marxists have missed over and over what he meant by this. Perhaps counterintuitively, clarity backfires here, allowing Engels to be understood without the reader being forced to reckon with his more profound implications. This video, I hope, will force the viewer to do such a reckoning. First and foremost, it is important to grasp that, for Marx, utopianism refers to a broadly conceived approach to thinking about politics, specifically about how radical societal transformation could be achieved. Though Marx understood his philosophy as superseding utopianism, rendering it obsolete, he had a healthy respect for the utopians that came before him. Marx understood them to have performed essential work that paved the way for his own. It follows, then, that utopian was not intended by Marx as an insult, at least not categorically. He certainly did not mean something as vague as an unrealistic vision of the future. As we will see, many proposals that appear eminently reasonable, even obvious, qualify as utopian in the Marxist sense. The stereotype that utopias are unrealistic, of course, has its basis in reality. Charles Fourier, one of the more interesting utopian figures, suggested that the world ought to be divided into some 6 million phalanxes, individual communities adhering to his design, each composed of exactly 1,620 persons. This number was ideal, as it ensured that persons of each of Fourier's hypothesized 810 personality types, determined by which of the 12 passions were dominant in an individual, was provided with a mate of the same type. And as odd as that may sound, it pales in comparison to some of his other proposals, such as his suggestion that phalanxes should, quote, divide children between the ages of 4 and 15 and a half into two instinctual corps, the little bands and little hordes. The little bands would be responsible for the maintenance of collective luxury, while the little hordes would perform tasks which are repugnant either to the senses or to self-esteem. This latter group, by the way, is who would be responsible for cleaning up communal meals. And lest one think Fourier is suggesting to divide children along the lines of sex, he makes clear that he believes 1/3 of boys to, quote, have a taste for good manners and tranquil occupations, meaning they would be encouraged to join the little girls who comprise the bulk of the little bands. Similarly, 1/3 of all girls have boyish inclinations and love to horn in on boys' games. They are called tomboys. They, of course, would join the boys in the little hordes. The goal, Fourier explains, is to lead the little hordes to the beautiful by way of the good, and the little bands to the good by way of the beautiful. To modern readers, Fourier's vision likely seems unrealistic to the point of being quaint. Proposals of this sort were striking, even to their intended readership, but they were not dreamt up entirely without reason. Utopian visionaries were in competition with one another to secure the backing of wealthy financiers. This was indeed the essence of their political strategy. As Marx scholar Hal Draper summarized, they blueprinted an ideal communal colony, imagined full-blown from the cranium of the leader, to be financed by the philanthropic rich under the wing of benevolent power. The utopianism offered by Robert Owen was of a more practical character, being based upon purely business foundation, and is thereby perhaps more palatable to modern readership. Illustrating this comparative realism, in 1823, Owen proposed the relief of the distress in Ireland by communist colonies and drew up complete estimates of costs of founding them, yearly expenditure, and probable revenue. And in his definite plan for the future, the technical working out of details was managed with such practical knowledge, ground plan, front and side, and bird's eye views all included, that the Owen method of social reform, once accepted, there is from the practical point of view little to be said against the actual arrangement of details. The many colonies he founded throughout his life were meant to prove his hypothesis that society may be formed so as to exist without crime, without poverty, with health greatly improved, with little, if any, misery, and with intelligence and happiness increased 100-fold, and no obstacle whatsoever intervenes at this moment except ignorance to prevent such a state of society from becoming universal. Owen took the experience gained from each of his failed communes and applied it to the next, refining his approach along the way. Owen's quasi-scientific experimentalism was reflected in the character of his utopia, whose goal was to govern or treat all society as the most advanced physicians govern and treat their patients, with forbearance and kindness for the poor, who have become so through the irrationality and injustice of the present most irrational system of society. Socialism was, for Owen and those like him, primarily about the rational management of society for the betterment of all citizens. Following this conception, the task of socialist theory is to devise hypotheses about what sort of management was the most rational. Though Owen was more cynical about the upper classes than most utopians of his time were, understanding clearly that the upper classes were responsible for the very misery in the lower classes he sought to remedy, he nevertheless felt firmly this great change must and will be accomplished by the rich and powerful. There are no other parties to do it. It is a waste of time, talent, and pecuniary means for the poor to contend in opposition to the rich and powerful. And where Owen frames his reliance on the upper class in essentially pragmatic terms, making no claims as to the moral character of the ruling class, and indicating only that the ruling classes must transform the world because no one else has the power, other utopians offered their support more enthusiastically. As they saw it, only the wealthy had access to the cultural upbringing and education required to attain the moral enlightenment of socialist thought. It is perhaps not a surprise that Owen went bankrupt in pursuit of his utopian dreams, spending the last 2 decades of his life as a labor union organizer, while many of his utopian peers grew wealthy by appealing to the upper class's philanthropic spirit. This misplaced faith in the ruling class, not their scheming and blueprinting of the future, makes utopian socialists what they are. The utopians believed, as do their spiritual successors today, that class society could be convinced to redeem itself of its own accord, so long as it was provided with a quality argument compelling it to do so. Once the correct argument favoring an alternative order was devised and the proper experiment illustrating that order's possibility was performed, those with power to change the world would. Lenin described this deeper essence of utopianism well when he wrote that, in politics, utopia is a wish that can never come true, neither now nor afterward, a wish that is not based on social forces and is not supported by the growth and development of political, class, forces. Utopian socialists in the mold of Fourier and Owen are, of course, quite rare today. Such political fantasizing was easier to take seriously in the context of the 18th and 19th centuries, when liberal democratic revolutions challenged the authority of the monarchy, and the emerging industrial bourgeoisie eroded the economic rule of feudal lords. In today's day and age, where philosophers like Francis Fukuyama have gone so far as to proclaim that Western society has reached the end of history, such baseless conjecture is typically dismissed out of hand. But we should not be too quick in assuming that this means utopianism has been done away with. Rather, it has simply evolved. The phrase scientific socialism has long been a source of misunderstanding, especially among those not able to read Marx in his original German. In modern parlance, to be scientific means to approach subject matter with a degree of objectivity, to measure said object in quantifiable terms, and to subject these measurements to repeat study to ensure reproducibility. But politics proves an especially difficult object to study in these terms. Mainstream political scientists, despite millions of dollars of funding, institutional support, and often the cooperation of world governments, almost certainly fail to meet such a standard. What hope could political radicals possibly have? Fortunately, this is not a standard Marx expected radicals to meet, for this is not the science Marx had in mind. The German language distinguishes between Wissenschaft, literally translated to the craft of knowing, and Naturwissenschaft, what we in English call the natural sciences. As Nietzsche translator Walter Kaufmann noted, the German Wissenschaft does not bring to mind only, perhaps not even primarily, the natural sciences, but any serious, disciplined, rigorous quest for knowledge. That is to say, Wissenschaft includes the natural sciences, yes, but not to the exclusion of the social sciences or even the humanities. All can be subject to rational discourse and systematic study. They are, though subjective in the sense of relating to the phenomenon of subjectivity, i.e. consciousness, by no means arbitrary. The complexity of this word's meaning is illustrated well by the title of Friedrich Nietzsche's 1882 book, Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft. It has been translated into English as either the gay science or the joyful wisdom, neither entirely satisfactory. What is impossible to capture in translation is Nietzsche's cultural context, in which the gay science was a stock phrase referring to the technical skill required to write compelling poetry. Nietzsche's book, of course, is not a manual instructing the reader in the proper technique of artful prose, but rather a series of ruminations on what it would mean to live artfully, that is, to live as though one's life itself were a work of art. Nietzsche's philosophy, then, is definitively not a contribution to the natural sciences. This is likely why the original English translation rendered the work's title as The Joyful Wisdom. And yet, German has a word for wisdom, Weisheit, and Nietzsche deliberately opted not to title his book Die Fröhliche Weisheit. Again, quoting Kaufmann, what should be gay is science, not wisdom. Science suggests seriousness, discipline, and rigor, and these matter to Nietzsche. Science is, therefore, undoubtedly the superior translation, but it is impossible to deny that meaning is lost in the process. Nietzsche's subject is one for which English has no name. I, of course, do not mean to suggest that Marx and Nietzsche's philosophies were the same, merely that the word Wissenschaft has broader connotations than suggested by the English science, and that many, almost certainly the majority, of Marx commentators have missed this fact. For instance, sociologist Irving M. Zeitlin writes that, quote, Karl Marx conceived of much of his work as providing both a scientific account of the nature of capitalism and a scientific basis for the socialist movement of his time. The possibility of revolution rested on certain objective economic and political conditions, which could be grasped through a careful study of the structure and tendencies of capitalism. Marx's theory is empirically based and informed by the spirit of scientific inquiry. It is quite understandable why a sociologist would be interested in viewing Marx as a prototypical social scientist, but the interpretation he offers has, in fact, historically proven more popular outside academia than within. Indeed, its first notable proponents were the socialists of the German Social Democratic Party, whose prominence in the Second International, the primary international organization of radical parties between 1889 and 1915, canonized it as Marxist orthodoxy for an entire generation of radicals. Its prominence was briefly challenged by Lenin's repudiation of the Second International's leading theoretician, Karl Kautsky, in 1915, and the subsequent success of the Russian Revolution, but it would be revived in spirit by the Third International after Stalin's ascension to power in 1928 and disseminated throughout the globe as the one official Marxism. The ethos of this quasi-scientific Marxism has come to be known as reflection theory, as its basic principle was that the consciousness of men was a reflection of their material circumstances. Quote, "It is a fundamental idea of materialism that the multifold phenomena of the world constitute different forms of matter in motion, and that matter is primary, since it is the source of sensations, ideas, mind, and that mind is secondary, derivative, since it is a reflection of matter, a reflection of being. The mind, its relationship to reality being mediated by the senses, is supposed to form impressions of the world based on the content of material actuality, the accuracy of this copy being determined by the distorting effects of ideology and the limitations of the senses." This could be seen as echoing Marx's famous declaration that, quote, "Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. But the conflation of material circumstances with life is a far more significant divergence than it may at first appear." Indeed, this conflation splits the Marxian Wissenschaft into Marxism as Naturwissenschaft and as Weltanschauung, into a natural scientific theory and a political worldview. As Rudolf Hilferding, among the most important and widely read theoreticians of the Second International, argued in his most well-known work, Finance Capital, that, quote, "Marxism is only a theory of the laws of movement of society, formulated in general terms by the Marxian conception of history. But the validity of Marxism, which includes insight into the necessity of socialism, is by no means a matter of value judgments. It is quite possible for someone convinced of the final victory of socialism to fight against it." The separation of Marxist science from socialist politics, which is to say theory from practice, coincided with a period of capitalist stability and expansion during which the socialist parties played an increasingly large role in the management of the state, which is to say they oversaw this stability and expansion. The idea was that socialist parties, by entering into the capitalist state and successfully managing its affairs, could improve the lives of the working class and ensure that, when open class struggle broke out, the state would not take the side of the capitalists. Socialist parties could, therefore, work for the benefit of the socialist cause without working for the immediate realization of a socialist vision. As Rupert Woodfin puts it, quote, "The leaders of the Second International took cover behind the idea that Marxism was a science, and the revolution would come whatever anyone did. So there was no need for them to draw up any revolutionary plans or take any revolutionary action. Revolution became a theoretical issue, and the focus was on achieving practical, reformist goals, such as votes for all, more democracy, better pay and conditions." Some, such as Edward Bernstein, acknowledged the anti-revolutionary implications of this strategy with frank honesty, whereas thinkers like Kautsky and Hilferding continued to profess a belief in the ultimate necessity of class struggle. The First World War exposed their proclamations as the empty word games they were, as socialist parties around the globe rallied behind the cause of their own native country in what was recognized, even at the time, as a pointless imperialist war. Ironically, for all their celebration of Marxism's supposedly scientific character, the transformation of reformist parties into forces of counter-revolution was something predicted by Marxism. Rosa Luxemburg recognized the risk as early as 1899 in her classic refutation of Bernstein's open revisionism, social reform or revolution. Moreover, she recognized that the crux of her argument applied equally to the nominally radical Kautsky, leading her to break with him in 1910. These Marxists of a natural scientific bent, while understanding Marx's political critique of the utopian socialists, largely failed to appreciate his philosophical critique, and, as a consequence, expressed their basic errors in a different political project. They rightly refrained from attempting to build socialism on behalf of the working class, but shared their belief that they, armed with the knowledge of Marx's hypothetico-deductive system, knew, prior to the outbreak of class struggle, the knowledge necessary for its success. The alternative to this, the science of authentic Marxism, is the method of revolutionary criticism, the method of praxis. Written on Marx's tombstone is the famed 11th of his theses on Feuerbach, which reads, "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Taken literally, rather at face value, this thesis is almost nonsensical. According to the Open Syllabus Project, the text most commonly cited in Ivy League course curriculum is Plato's Republic, a treatise on how society might be organized following principles he determined to be just. By every account, Plato intended to interpret and change the world, and he was by no means the first or last to do so. Moreover, Marx could hardly have been ignorant of this, as he earned his doctorate with a thesis on Greek philosophy. Though this face value interpretation is obviously nonsensical, it is precisely in this way that it has been most often interpreted, especially by those Marxists pushing back against the errors of orthodox Marxism just described. As Cyril Smith writes in Marx at the Millennium, the 11th thesis has too often been read as an admonition to theorize a bit and then get on with the real job of making a revolution. An observation he made based on his many years spent as an orthodox Trotskyist, radical deeply embedded in leftist organizational culture. This misreading comes from mentally inserting a conjective adverb where one does not exist. Even Engels was guilty of this error. Indeed, he published Marx's theses posthumously, and in his work as an editor, actually inserted the word however between the point and is to change it. The presence of however would seem to suggest that interpretation and change are, for Marx, counterposed, two options between which we must choose, the latter being preferable. In reality, however, the two are inextricably linked. The errors of the philosophers, then, was to regard interpretation and transformation as separate activities. Lenin once famously wrote that, quote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement." He's not wrong, per se, but he comes close to echoing sentiments Marx held as a young man and later explicitly disavowed, expressed in such quotes as, quote, "The head of emancipation is philosophy, its heart the proletariat." Marx was able to overcome such elitism by recognizing that Lenin's quip is equally true when reversed. Without a revolutionary movement, there can be no revolutionary theory. Marx summarized this key insight well in an 1843 letter written to the editor of the newspaper for which he then wrote, quote, "The reform of consciousness consists entirely in making the world aware of its own consciousness, in arousing it from its dream of itself, in explaining its own actions to it. Our whole aim can only be to translate religious and political problems into their self-conscious human form." This stands in stark opposition to the mechanical materialism of orthodox Marxism. Marx's critique of reductive materialism in his first thesis on Feuerbach applies directly to the orthodox Marxism's reflection theory. Quote, "The chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively." That is to say, materialism had, until that point, regarded people as the passive products of their environment. In reality, people are the products of their own attempts to come to terms with their environment, both natural and social. This insight, though not innately communist, is what ultimately led Marx to embrace radical politics. The seed was planted in 1842 when Marx was asked to report on debates surrounding the Prussian wood theft laws. These laws violated long-established custom and deprived the peasantry of their right to forage firewood and graze their herds in forests now legally classified as the private property of others. As Marx wrote, quote, "Just as it is not fitting for the rich to lay claim to the alms distributed in the street, so also in regard to these alms of nature." Though such words are uncharacteristically moralistic in light of Marx's mature writings, it was with this story that he experienced for the first time the embarrassment of having to take part in discussions on so-called material interests. This story brought to Marx's attention not only the plight of the poor, but their agency in fighting against it. This was the first in what would prove to be several lessons the working class taught Marx. Lenin was not, for the record, entirely ignorant of this dimension of Marxism. Far from it, he showed a greater capacity to respond creatively to the masses' self-directed activity than did any other revolutionary figure of the 20th century. But this responsiveness was instinctual and consequently inconsistent until his study of Hegel's Science of Logic in 1914 and 1915, only after which it became principled and philosophical. The fruits of his effort are apparent. Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, written in the summer of 1916, is in one sense an imitation of Bukharin's earlier Imperialism and World Economy. But while the substance of Lenin's economic analysis was no doubt taken from Bukharin, it was Lenin rather than Bukharin who first recognized the potential of anti-imperialist movements to serve as loci in the global struggle against capitalism. This ability to creatively respond to developments as they occur, to uncover their deeper meanings and give them voice in theoretical forms, is the essence of what we might call living Marxism, in contrast to orthodox Marxism. Lenin, prior to his study of Hegel, influentially claimed that Marxism, quote, emerged as the direct and immediate continuation of the teachings of German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism. But it is in reality the direct and immediate continuation of the self-conscious reflections of the radical proletariat. German philosophy, English political economy, and French socialism armed this theoretical wing of the proletariat with valuable conceptual tools, no doubt. But the primary source by which Marxism is renewed is the struggle itself. Quote, "The doctrine that men are products of circumstances and that changed men are products of changed circumstances forgets that it is men who change circumstances. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice." This idea, commonly referred to as praxis, is not necessarily unknown to the modern left, but it is known in a way that renders it nonsensical. The left speaks of a unity of theory and practice, but by this they mean nothing more than the unification of theory with practice and attempting to realize the former through the latter. This amounts to the claim that the left should have ideas and try to act upon them. That is, of course, better than the alternative of having ideas we don't intend to act upon, but it is hardly a uniquely leftist or even distinctly political idea. I engage with praxis of this sort when I order breakfast from McDonald's to realize in practice the idea that hash browns taste good and satisfy my hunger. Ironically, this pseudo-praxis expresses the essence of utopianism that Marxism is supposed to surpass and replace. The socialist intellectual, through careful study of history and society, arrives at the final, absolute truths, knowledge of which it bestows upon the working class when they are ready to listen. Socialists are not, in this picture, part of the working class, in its movement of struggle, working alongside them to devise solutions to problems as they emerge, but teachers in search of students. There could be no socialism further removed from authentic Marxism than this. Praxis of the uniquely Marxian character works the other way around. We don't begin with our ideas and attempt to force them on reality. Quote, "The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. The ideas and principles of communism are uncovered in the activity of the working class in its independent political organization and struggle as a class. This is not a process we can stand above. We will either be an organic part of it or have nothing to do with it. Hilferding's bifurcation of Marxism into its scientific and political halves amounts to nothing less than a rejection of the process whereby Marxist epistemology functions. The first edition of Marx's masterwork, Capital Volume 1, was published in German in 1867. In it, Marx presented a critique of political economy, which is to say the functioning of capitalist society and its reflection in the theory of the early economists, who were then called political economists. Among the many ideas Marx explores in this work, the most important may be that of commodity fetishism, the phenomenon whereby capitalist society appears differently to those living within it than it actually is. As Marx writes, quote, "A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties." Like the water in which the fish swims, the true nature of commodities eludes us, not because it is foreign, but because it is so profoundly familiar. We have all lived our whole lives in capitalist society, never knowing a time where the relationship between ourselves and goods was not mediated by the exchange of currency, our access to currency, in turn, typically mediated by our willingness and ability to sell to an employer our ability to work. We say that a commodity is worth this or that amount of money, as though this could somehow be determined by placing it under a powerful enough microscope. Value, then, appears to belong to the objects themselves, as though it were a physical property rather than a social relation. Bourgeois economics, rather than cutting through this mystification, reinforces it by presenting it in a formalized, quasi-scientific form. Quote, "Vulgar economics relies on the mere semblance, as opposed to the law which regulates and determines the phenomena. It believes that ignorance is a sufficient reason." This is because, for their purposes, capitalism's appearances are an entirely adequate basis for theory. Quote, "Although classical political economy had reduced value to its labor content, it had never once asked why did this content, labor, assume this form, value. It never once asked itself these questions because it never once had a need to know the answer, and every reason to want to avoid ever finding out." This idea is present in Capital Volume 1 from the very first edition, but the chapter discussing it underwent considerable revision during the preparation of the French translation of Capital that appeared in installments between 1872 and 1875. Marx's thinking on the matter had clearly developed considerably in the 3-year interim. Though the formal content is not drastically changed, Marx's presentation of the concept is far clearer, more forceful, and lays stress on an idea only implicit in the chapter's original form, and the primary impetus for this development was almost certainly the Paris Commune of 1871. As Ryadunievskaya argues, quote, "The totality of the reorganization of society by the communards shed new insight into the perversity of relations under capitalism. The proletariat demonstrated how the absolute new form of cooperation, released from its value integument, expresses itself. This was so clearly the absolute opposite of the dialectic movement of labor under capitalism, forced into a value form, that all the fetishisms were stripped off of capitalist production. That is to say, the independent revolutionary action of the proletariat in the Paris Commune clarified for Marx theoretical truths that were previously obfuscated, most crucially commodity fetishism. The Paris Commune dramatically deepened Marx's appreciation of a fact he was only aware of dimly beforehand, that being that the false appearances of capitalism are, at the same time, its true essence. It is not simply that relationships between people in capitalist society take the appearance of relationships between things. This is their true nature. Insofar as they sell their ability to labor in exchange for a wage, laborers in capitalist society must objectify themselves in the literal sense of being regarded as an object. The capitalist purchases from the laborer their ability to work for a set period of time, not their humanity. If the capitalist could purchase the former without dealing with the latter, all the better for him. Labor power does not go on strike after all. People do. To allow Marx to explain in his own words, to the producers, therefore, the social relations between their private labors appear as what they are, i.e., they do not appear as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material relations between persons and social relations between things. The fetish, the illusion, is not to see relationships between people in capitalist society as relationships between things, but to mistake this strange state of affairs as a consequence of reality, when it is actually a characteristic of a historically specific mode of social arrangement. So long as consciousness remains confined to the horizons of capitalist society, this illusion is a wholly adequate perception. Only when the class struggle breaks out, and those elements of life not confined within the categories of capitalist logic let themselves be known, does the fetishistic perception of capitalism begin to prove inadequate. Only then does the mind seek to explain phenomena that cannot be reduced to the categories of capitalism, and it therefore strives to see the creation of new categories, new ways of living. The communards, of course, were not sitting down to write detailed theoretical treatises during the brief 2 months the Commune existed. They naturally had more than their fair share of practical difficulties that demanded their immediate attention. Nevertheless, without sitting down and doing theory, the Parisian proletariat did theory. Their activity itself constituted an original and valuable contribution to the collective store of revolutionary wisdom, provided others were able to open their eyes and recognize this contribution for what it was. This is precisely what the best Marxists have been doing ever since. It is this methodology that made Lenin's imperialism a classic, and relegated Bukharin's imperialism and world economy to a mere footnote. H.G. Wells, famous today for his pioneering works of science fiction literature, but well known in his own time for his thoughts on a wide range of subjects, once commented that, quote, "It was Marx who finally fettered the two ideas of socialism and democracy together." Being a socialist himself, one might assume that Wells was commending Marx for his historic contribution to socialist theory, but this comment was intended as a condemnation rather than commendation. As he argued, though there, quote, was a certain plausibility in Marx's suggestion that the mass losers in the struggle for gain would necessarily be in favor of the abolition of private property, but it did not follow at all that they would be able to grasp the idea of collectivized property and take an intelligent controlling interest in its collective administration. Since the untutored masses of expropriated people are obviously unable to discharge the functions of an administrative receiver, it is to mental and not to social classes that socialists have to appeal. At only minor risk of overstatement, authentic Marxism can be understood as the categorical refutation of everything Wells's socialism represented. Rather than appealing to the mental classes, Marx's was a program for how the working class might raise themselves to the level of the mental class, not by listening to Marxists, but by learning to trust and learn from themselves. Marxists, to be sure, play a part in this process, but the part we play is the same as that played by all others. We are, quote, but the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others, who have the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. This advantage is real, to be sure, but it is not such that it allows us to stand apart from and above the working class. Wells was right, of course, that the working class cannot, overnight, take up the reins of society and hope to be successful in the endeavor. In addition to the work on the ground already carried out by the working class, there is administration and bureaucracy, without which the modern world could not hope to function. The working class will need to develop the skills necessary to carry out this side of things. But Marxism, far from being unaware of this reality, is the only socialist philosophy with a serious answer for how these skills might be developed, save certain strains of anarchism whose answer is the same as ours. While thinking he had developed a new philosophy designed to address the gross inadequacies of Marxist thinking, Wells had just reverted to a well-established pre-Marxian idea. Wells's insistence on the necessity of an educated class to lead the movement and manage society on behalf of the working class once a post-capitalist society is established is nothing more than a reversion to Owen's socialism. His is a perfect case study supporting Sartre's argument that, quote, an anti-Marxist argument is only the apparent rejuvenation of a pre-Marxist idea. A so-called going beyond Marxism will be at worst only a return to pre-Marxism, at best only the rediscovery of a thought already contained in the philosophy which one believes he has gone beyond. What Wells was struggling, and failing, to go beyond was the most fundamental Marxist concept of all, the class struggle. As he saw it, the doctrine of class struggle, at least insofar as it is seen as a potential path to establishing a socialist society, was nothing more than the, quote, mystical and dangerous idea of reconstituting the world on a basis of mere resentment and destruction. Wells is once more unconsciously paralleling the earlier Robert Owen, in whose eyes the class struggle, which he saw as class hate, violated Christian principles. For Wells, however, the issue is not so much moral as it is practical. If an educated elite must lead the working class for it to succeed, what good could come from the working class alienating that elite through class struggle? The hostility to class struggle expressed by utopian socialists is almost always a veiled hostility to democracy as such, or in Wells's case, unveiled. The world ought to be ruled, he argued in a 1932 book titled After Democracy, quote, not by everybody, but by a politically minded organization open, with proper safeguards, to everybody. Such a system, he said, could be found at the national level in Stalinist Russia. That an ardent anti-Marxist like Wells, who once wrote that, quote, there would have been creative revolution, and possibly creative revolution of a far finer type if Karl Marx had never lived, could see in Stalin's regime a mode of governance worth emulating across the globe speaks volumes, both to Wells' elitist character and the inauthenticity of Stalin's Marxism. Marxists view the matter in precisely opposite terms to those of Wells. How will the working class ever take up the reins of society unless it learns to strike out on its own and think for itself? Alienating the educated elite is not desirable as an end in itself, but such people will always be alienated by the sight of ordinary people not deferring to their presumed greater wisdom. The point of socialism is to forge a society in which all are free to determine the course of their lives to the greatest extent possible. Free of labor coerced under the threat of starvation and homelessness, and such self-determination cannot be bestowed upon others. It must instead be won, both against the external forces of reaction and the internal forces of repression. Marx and Engels made this argument in The German Ideology, writing that, quote, both for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. And the German Ideology is far from the only place that they make this argument. It is one that appears in their works repeatedly. Speaking against a minority faction in the Communist League, quote, whereas we say to the workers, you will have to go through 15 or 20 or 50 years of civil wars and international wars, not only in order to change extant conditions, but also in order to change yourselves and to render yourselves fit for political dominion. You, on the other hand, say to the workers, we must attain to power at once, or else we may just as well go to sleep. This is but one more example from a wide selection of possible quotes to choose from, but I will refrain for the sake of time. This is the essence of the practicable distinction between scientific and utopian socialism. As Hal Draper put it, it is the choice between socialism from below and socialism from above. As I hope is by now clear, this should not be interpreted as narrowly meaning authoritarian versus libertarian, as plenty of utopians have sought the establishment of a society of greater freedom. The difference is not over who deserves freedom, but who can be trusted to bring it about. In Draper's terms, these are the two souls of socialism, and it is a sad fact that today the above spirit far exceeds the below in popularity. Even within Marxism, socialism from below and its philosophical expression have always been subversive tendencies, so much so that burying these elements of Lenin's thought was a central concern to propagandists in the USSR during the Stalin years. Rather than promoting the study of Lenin's study notes on Hegel, the Soviets enshrined his earlier materialism and Pyrrho-criticism as his crowning achievement in Marxian philosophy, even though Lenin's analysis of Hegel was undertaken precisely because he recognized the inadequacy of his old orthodox beliefs. Post-colonial scholars did much the same to Frantz Fanon in the context of academia, professional philosophers to Antonio Gramsci, and I could very well go on. The eclipse, or burial, of authentic Marxism has meant the unabashed resurgence of utopianism, if it can ever be said to have been overcome in the first place. Indeed, Marxism has so routinely been misinterpreted and or misrepresented in terms compatible with utopianism that the functional death of Marxist parties worldwide in the aftermath of the collapse of the USSR had little effect on the content of socialist thinking on the whole. So degraded had the common understanding of Marxism become that some, like Cyril Smith and Ellen Mexens Wood, celebrated the possibility that, in the wake of the Soviet collapse, quote, the path had been opened for the renewed study of Marx's actual ideas. No longer would we be presented with the false choice between rigidly centralized state control or the exploitative anarchy of the market. It seems, to me, doubtful that this has occurred at any scale. Today's utopian socialism primarily takes the form of speculative, progressive liberalism that eschews the grand emancipatory visions of early utopians like Fourier, their self-confidence eroded by the collapse of the Soviet experiment and the retreat of mid-century Keynesian capitalism. Progressives instead propose governmental policies that might curtail the extremities of the market. Ideas of French economist Thomas Piketty are perhaps the most influential utopian thought today, arguing that if the rate of return on capital rises more quickly than overall economic growth, that increased return logically must come at the expense of the poor. To address this, quote, Piketty proposes a global system of progressive wealth taxes that would reduce inequality and avoid the vast majority of wealth coming under the control of a tiny minority. Though not every progressive today agrees with Piketty in detail, the general outlines of his work are representative of progressivism's modern paradigm, as seen in the political programs of politicians like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. Though such political figures are lent a veneer of pragmatism by their proximity to power, their accomplishments, or rather lack thereof, reveal their true nature. Though today's utopians know better than to place their hopes in the alleged noble spirits of the ruling class, they still naively hope to realize their ambitions by working within the political institutions that same class established. This strange mix of cynicism and guilelessness is a defining feature of modern utopianism and reflects the unique historical circumstances out of which it emerged. The current popularity of utopianism is relatively easy to explain. Quote, the less freedom there is in a country, the scantier the manifestations of open class struggle, and the lower the educational level of the masses, the more easily political utopias usually arise, and the longer they persist. In other words, utopianism predominates political discourse in circumstances not conducive to revolutionary struggle. It is not coincidental that, contrary to the hopes of Smith and Wood, many of today's most popular utopian ideas first emerged as an attempt to grapple with the failure of the USSR. While recent years have seen resurgent interests in and support for unions, helping up a long-standing trend of decline in membership across the Western world, union strength still falls dramatically short of where it would need to be for there to be a widespread perception that the working class has the power to transform the world in its image should it choose to do so. Moreover, state and capital have spent decades refining increasingly successful techniques for domesticating unions, which has done much to undermine their effectiveness as a vehicle of class struggle. Even if union membership reached or surpassed its historical peak in the 1930s, they could not muster the leverage they once had. The working class is, therefore, mainly content with imagining a better world rather than fighting for it. It has let the weapon of criticism replace criticism by weapons. My point, of course, is not that such a development is useless. Far from it, such developments are a necessary precondition to any revolutionary awakening. But the responsibility of communists, those clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement, is to cultivate the potentialities latent in this development. Every ideological weapon in the arsenal of the ruling class will be deployed to stamp these potentialities out. This task is not only challenging, but existentially frightful. A fundamental axiom of utopianism is the belief that the right ideas will win out once they've been expressed loudly and forcefully enough. Marxism forces us to confront a sobering reality. Right ideas only win out when they demonstrate their usefulness, not in the abstract, but to people struggling to rediscover and articulate their agency through independent organization as a class. To do that, we must involve ourselves directly in this process and utilize the Marxian conceptual toolkit to make sense of the situation confronting us here and now. Marxism, correctly understood, aids radicals in operating from a minority position in a world whose institutions are designed to suppress us. It identifies fault lines in capitalism's daily functions that can be seized upon to organically connect the struggles of non-radical workers with the radical aims of socialists. There is no guarantee we will succeed in this task, but indulging in the illusory comfort of utopianism is not a viable alternative, not when there is as much at stake as there is today.